Hello, everybody, and welcome to New Ways Ministries webinar entitled A Rainbow Synod, Global LGBTQ+ Perspectives on Synodality So Far. My name is Frank DiBernardo, and I serve as the Executive Director of New Ways Ministry, and I am delighted that so many of you could join us for this very exciting program about a very exciting moment in our church, the Global Synod that Pope Francis has called. And we are so delighted to learn at how many LGBTQ groups and how many institutional Catholic churches reached out to LGBTQ groups to be part of this process and to let their voices be heard. And I know that many of you who are attending were part of a variety of different processes. We're excited because we have a representative from every continent except Antarctica. And if they had LGBTQ+ synod sessions on Antarctica, we would have had someone from there too.
Let us pray. Great Spirit of God, during the Synod, bless and forge your people with a new and compassionate heart to be God's healings, mercy, and reconciliation on earth. Push us to re-examine the call of Christ, to wash the feet of others, and urge us to reach out to those most marginalized and bring them in. The LGBTQ community, the poor, migrants, and citizens displaced by war, violence, and the environment. Dare us to bring new life into places and people that have been abandoned or forgotten, so that all may raise a joyful song to you. And we make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Dwayne. So as Frank and I mentioned, we're so glad to have you all here for this conversation. As a global church, it is essential that we be listening to our siblings from different contexts. Doing so not only raises our awareness and builds solidarity for the LGBTQ+ movement, but I think it deepens our own faith too. So as Frank mentioned, we have panelists from 6 continents, and we have people registered from many countries. So it's truly a global conversation. As most of you know, the Synod on Synodality is at its halfway point. Since last October, millions of Catholics worldwide participated in listening sessions and surveys that led to thousands of reports. New Ways Ministry hosted a series of spiritual conversations for LGBTQ+ people and allies, and 1,000 people participated. And the fruits of those conversations became our own Synod report called From the Margins to the Center. But in many, many places, in many diocesan and national reports, LGBTQ issues were quite prominent, and we'll hear a little bit about that from our panelists. I'm in the United States, and even here, where the Bishops' Conference is quite conservative, appeals for LGBTQ inclusion and justice were reflected in the national synthesis as an urgent priority. So this month, the Vatican Synod Office will release a working document that draws together more than 100 national reports submitted by bishops' conferences. And this document will then be studied by regional assemblies of bishops and hopefully other Catholics to provide more feedback to Rome. And then a year from now, in October 2023, the bishops will gather at the Vatican to produce a final document after a month of conversations themselves. But today we pause to distill some of what LGBTQ+ Catholics and allies have learned so far. What insights were most pronounced in this local phase? What lessons have been learned? What worked and didn't work? And we'll look a little at the future. How do we move forward from here in our advocacy for an LGBTQ inclusive church? So a little bit about how today will go. Shortly, I will turn it over to our panelists for their opening comments. Each will speak for 3 minutes or so after I introduce them, and then we'll begin a moderated conversation. Some of you have submitted questions with your registration, but if you have a question that arises as the panelists are speaking, I invite you to use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit that. As I know from previous webinars, it's impossible to get to every question, but I'll do my best. So I now invite Dr. Alfred Pang from Singapore. Alfred has a PhD in theology and education from Boston College, and he is involved with a diocesan ministry that looks into the pastoral care of LGBTQ Catholics. There he helped design and facilitate the Synod conversations for LGBTQ plus Catholics and their loved ones in Singapore, where he currently researches and ministers. He also contributed to the writing of the report based on these conversations. So I invite you, Alfred, to make your opening remarks.
Thank you, Bob, for your kind introduction. I hope you're able to hear me. It's very early morning here in Singapore. It's like 4 a.m., but always happy to be here at the New Ways event. Just a little disclaimer here that the views expressed here are my own. They do not represent the views and opinions of the ministry that I'm in, though I'll be drawing on my own experiences within it. I thought I would do 3 things. First, I would set up the context in Singapore so that we begin to appreciate the importance of the Synod on Synodality for us here in Singapore. And then I'll just describe very briefly what we did. And then I'll move on to the last segment, which is just to highlight some of the key outcomes. So first, the context in Singapore. We are in Southeast Asia, a very, very small country on the map at the tip of Peninsula Malaysia. We are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, that is largely conservative culturally. In fact, it was only in August last month that the Prime Minister announced the intent to repeal 377A, a colonial law that criminalizes sex between men. And there is still an ongoing debate on whether this ought to be pushed through. Catholics and Christians, they are Catholics and Christians from other denominations are not the majority, something to take note of. And within the Catholic Church in Singapore, there is a general silence on the experiences of LGBT Catholics. The Archbishop, who is now Cardinal Goh, however, has been supportive of a diocesan ministry that was set up about 5 years ago to pastorally accompany LGBT Catholics. So I have been part of this ministry that has grown to become a community and help design and facilitate the synodal conversations. Knowing this context will hopefully allow you to appreciate the significance of the Synod for LGBT Catholics in Singapore. It gave the ministry that I am in a formal opportunity to do at least 2 things. One, within the ministry, we use the synodal process as a way to grow spiritually as a community of faith and collectively discern and imagine our mission within the church in Singapore. 2, more significantly, the Synod was also an opportunity to exercise our prophetic call by breaking the silence around the experiences of LGBT Catholics and their loved ones in Singapore. So what did we do? We reflected on the 2 key questions. First, how the church has journeyed with LGBT Catholics and their loved ones. And second, what our dreams for the church are. So there are two levels. We hosted these conversations within the community, where both questions were reflected progressively over 6 weekly sessions of spiritual conversations grounded in prayer, scripture, mutual listening, and co-discernment. And at the second level, which is external, the community also held a separate Zoom session for the wider church in Singapore to include non-members, people who were not in the community, who identify as LGBTQ, allies, and their families. So what are their key outcomes? I'm just going to mention 3, and then I'll give a kind of a final analysis. 1, LGBT Catholics have expressed their struggle with the tension between wanting to be part of the church and not always being welcomed, seen, or listened by the church as whole persons. There was hurt caused by religious authorities and judgment by other Catholics, which often made them hide their sexuality so as to be accepted by the non-LGBT majority. In doing so, LGBT Catholics have felt that they were less authentic despite their deep longing for God and their love for the universal church. Yet, LGBT Catholics have also demonstrated perseverance in choosing to stay in the church and serving in ministry, in spite of the fear of being outed, judged, and/or rejected. I just want to say something about what came up from our conversations with parents and their loved ones of LGBT Catholics. They expressed similar views. They shared about their struggles to reconcile the church's claim to love all and yet discriminate against the LGBT loved ones. They also shared the inadequacies to accompany the LGBT loved ones and hope that the church would offer them education and formation to help them do this. My third point would be collectively, or in fact unanimously, have expressed their dream of a church that truly welcomes everyone as created in God's image and likeness through listening, dialogue, and pastoral and spiritual accompaniment. Okay, just to offer my final remark, just to give a summary of how I see all of this. The gift of the Synod for LGBT Catholics in Singapore is that it has opened a providential and grace-filled space for us to be seen and heard for who we are. The silence broken has also pushed the wider church out of its posture of avoidance to recognize and wrestle with the complex reality of sexual diversity as impacting the lives of the faithful. Most significantly, a space is now created for the possibility of dialogue that can and must include the lived realities of LGBT persons and their loved ones, enduring to become a church that is more pastoral and just, patterned after the kenotic love of Jesus Christ. With the Synod, a dialogue on sexual diversity within the church in Singapore has only just begun. How it unfolds remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfred. Next, I'd like to introduce Mara Klein from Germany. Mara is one of the under 30 members of the German Church's Synodal Way and is involved in its forum on love, sexuality, and relationships. They have a Master's of Education in English and Religion and work at the University of Münster for the Department of Christian Social Ethics. So Mara, thank you for being here, and I welcome your comments.
Thank you for inviting me. I feel blessed being able to speak in this general setting. First off, of course, it's important to note that Germany has done a smidge more than a listening phase regarding the synodal process. I'm involved in the so-called Synodal Way in Germany since its official beginnings in 2020. And originally I've been selected as a representative of the youth, but so it's more or less a coincidence that I'm also the only non-binary member of the Synodal Assembly in Germany, and as such, very outspoken for queer rights. Me and 2 other members of the Catholic queer community in Germany are participating in a panel on love, relationships, and sexuality. And the panel has brought forward 6 texts, a base text speaking for a new understanding of sexuality, including a positive outlook on queer people, and 5 texts that call for concrete actions, 4 of which deal with queer rights. At the last assembly of the Synodal Way 1 month ago, the texts that demand renewal of the catechism passages on homosexuality and a text on equal employment rights already passed through the assembly and will be transmitted into the global synodal process. However, the base texts in which held the theological foundations for those texts failed, because we didn't get the necessary 2/3 majority of the bishops, even though there was a clear majority for the text amongst the bishops as well as the assembly at whole. I cannot put into words the devastation we felt when this text failed after over 2 years of voluntary work and hardly any constructive criticism that might have helped us to adjust it for majority. The text in question is available in English online, and I recommend reading it and spreading it. I will be sharing the link later in the chat, as well as a link to all the other texts that have been passed through the assembly, which have been translated into English. That said, the process is ongoing, and we are still awaiting the final outcome for our final 2 texts that demand the blessing of homosexual couples and recognition and equal rights for trans and intersex people. Only concerning, of course, the texts that deal with queer rights. There are many other texts that are very important, but we have a focus in this channel, obviously. When it comes to the bishops, I've witnessed both appalling ignorance and arrogance, and maybe even worse, indifference on the one hand, and surprising compassion as well as willingness, and sometimes even the ability to change on the other hand, especially concerning the matter of queer rights. I have little realistic hope for the texts that go to Rome for consideration. I don't know how much I can rely on a global process, especially considering how hard it is, even within my local church. However, I do have a considerable amount of hope for the realization of queer rights within those dioceses in Germany whose bishops voted for our texts. I'm aware of the privileges we enjoy in Germany compared to a global scale, and I hope that our texts and our more outspoken and braver amongst the bishops can have a positive influence on their brothers in a global synod. It's evident, and that fills me with hope, especially being here tonight, that a handful of queer people in this synodal way have changed the expected outcome completely. That we have so many texts on queer rights. It's an impact I didn't see coming in the beginning, and it's something. And even though we deserve so much more than what is asked for in the texts we produce, our impact is something to be proud of and something we hope to share with the global community.
Thank you very much, Mara. For our next speaker, I would like to invite Dumisani Dube from South Africa. Dumisani is a Zimbabwean-born LGBTI activist living in South Africa, and he is the leader of Holy Trinity Catholic Parish LGBTI ministry based in Johannesburg. His ministry was tasked with leading the listening circles for this synod in the Diocese of Johannesburg. Dumisani, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the generous introduction. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's 10 o'clock in the evening here in South Africa. And thank you very much for everybody that has joined us. So yes, Africa is a very dynamic region with which is rich in culture, and a lot of things are happening here. As you may know, that there has been a lot of homophobia within the church in Africa, and thanks to the Pope's progressive work towards towards inclusion of everyone, especially the marginalized, and that is the LGBTI, also with women. This was, of course, witnessed by the inclusion of LGBTIQ persons listening circles for the synodal process. The inclusion of the peer bodies here was met with great reception from the peer bodies, and also some backlash from non-peer bodies that did not understand. My ministry, which is Holy Trinity LGBTI ministry, based at Holy Trinity Catholic Church in Braamfontein, was privileged to be part of this history making, as we were invited to be in the steering committee to plan and prepare for the listening circles in the diocese. In preparation, we were tasked to communicate with all the parishes, some of which came to us Nicodemously with fear of being labeled, but some just went silent. We did not have any responses at all. Of course, during the listening circles, only queer people attended our listening circles, but a few for that matter. That is because labels still exist within our society and community here in South Africa. There were a few questions that were brought up. Is it a sin? Can I still receive communion? Can I still get married? But then after this listening circle, there was an analysis that we saw that there is new life within the queer community in our church. There is insights, so many of them. What worked and what didn't work is what we concentrated on and what we look forward into the future. Things like we identified spiritual needs of queer persons within our church, that they also need spiritual guidance. There was also the breaking of breaking the silence of the LGBTIQ persons in our church, the visibility that we are there, we are queer, we are here, and we are here to stay. There were also Zoom sessions that we managed to arrange with the Nigerian community that cannot have the privilege to be free as we are here in South Africa, which meant that a continuous and sustainable connection has to be maintained within our community. So we think that this synodal process and the inclusion of the queer bodies in the listening circles has helped us to manage and to sustain and to look into the future what we are going to have as a progressive and successful church. And thank you very much to New Ways Ministry for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dumisani. Our next speaker from Ireland is Ursula Halligan. Ursula is the former political editor of TV3 there, and now is the joint coordinator of We Are Church Ireland, a voluntary group that works for justice in the Roman Catholic Church, including on matters to do with sexuality and gender. In 2015, she came out publicly in the national media, just ahead of the same-sex marriage referendum there, which many believe helped influence the vote. Earlier this year, she graduated with a Master's of Philosophy in Theology from Trinity College Dublin. Congratulations, Ursula, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Robert, and hello to everyone. And it's really great to be here. I was the facilitator of an LGBT plus focus group, and that took part in the synodal process in Ireland. And I was also the person who synthesized the findings and put the whole report together. And that's what I just want to give you a brief overview of that report, what the issues that came up. Kevin Doran, he's a bishop in the west of Ireland, the Bishop of Elfin. It's a small diocese, the west of Ireland. He issued the invitation to set up an LGBT plus focus group. I think it was the only specifically LGBT focus group in Ireland, actually, that was set up. So myself and another person, David Carl, pulled together a group of 10 people, 4 women and 6 men, ranging in age from 30 plus to about 60 plus, who identified as LGBT plus. It was a challenging task just pulling together such a group, because many of the LGBT plus people we approached were cynical, they were suspicious about the process. Many of them just didn't want to have anything to do at all with the Catholic Church. Eventually, though, 10 people did agree to take part, and all of them were baptized Catholics, but only 4 still described themselves as Roman Catholic. 3 referred to themselves as Christian, 1 as atheist, 1 as spiritual, and 1 as no religion. The 10 of us met in a hotel on the 9th of April, and the way we saw it on the day, our task was to listen carefully to each other as we shared our individual stories about how the Catholic Church had impacted on our lives. And it was to revolve our sharing around 3 broad questions that the Bishop of Elfin had given us, and finally then to pull together and synthesize a report. Now, I'm not going to go into the questions. They're actually all in a report that Robert is going to put a link to in the chat box, that you can look at it. But what I am going to say is that the participants on that day, they drew upon their lived experience of the Catholic Church, and they spoke really graciously and with wonderful courage in response to those questions. And there were moments of profound insight, and as well as tears, anger, and laughter. And as I sat there, I realized that for all of us, this was the first time in our lives that we had ever come together with other LGBT plus people to talk specifically about the impact of the Catholic Church on us, because LGBT people just don't talk about such things. And an amazing revelation emerged out of that experience. As one of the participants put it, and I quote her verbatim, she said, "The level of faith in this room is unbelievable, and yet we're completely rejected." Another thing that struck us was the consistency of the responses that emerged from our sharing. 3 key themes emerged: the pain and the damage caused by the institutional Catholic Church to all LGBT plus people becoming obvious in adolescence. And the second theme was the rejection and hurt caused to LGBT plus people of faith by the institutional Catholic Church. And the third theme was the hypocrisy of the institutional Catholic Church on LGBT plus issues. Now, I took copious notes on the day, and when I put together the report, I forefronted and highlighted the verbatim comments that people made, because I wanted the voices of LGBT plus people. I wanted the hierarchy in Ireland, the bishops, to hear their voices, because I realized they had never really engaged with LGBT plus people as flesh and blood individuals. So if you read the report, you'll see that that's what I've done in it. During the course of that report, all the members, because they asked for the person who set up the report, Bishop Kevin Doran, to apologize, because many of them had felt terribly hurt by some of the comments he had made during the marriage referendum campaign in our country in 2015. So that was a difficult thing to put into the report, and it was a difficult thing for the bishop to have to see himself being called by the very group that he set up, calling on him to apologize for some of the comments he had made about LGBT people. In conclusion, we concluded with a set of proposals that the church could pursue, and one of those was an apology to all LGBT people from the Catholic Church, from the Pope downwards. Another one was for the Church to change its teaching on homosexuality so that it reflected the lived experience and the loving relationships of LGBT plus people. And also we suggested that the Church set up a dicastery for diversity and inclusion in the Vatican. Now, after we sent in our report in June, we were delighted that Bishop Kevin Doran, the bishop that we criticized in our report, published in full our 10-page report and in a prominent position on his diocese webpage, along with his own diocese synthesis report. And it got a lot of coverage, a lot of publicity in the country. Then in September, the Catholic Church published its national synthesis for the whole of Ireland. And in it, it referred specifically to our focus group. And it said a lot about the group, but here's a small bit of what it said. It said, quote, "Indeed, the visceral clarity of this particular focus group gave life to the rather more tentative and generalized position on inclusion offered elsewhere, pointing to the value of hearing directly the voices of the excluded or the disaffected. In summary, we felt that our voices had been heard in the synodal process and that taking part in the exercise had been a worthwhile and enlightening experience." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ursula. Our next speaker is from Mexico, Antonio Ortiz Silaseo. Antonio is the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics board representative from the Latin American and Caribbean region. He's also the co-founder of the Mexican Network of Rainbow Catholics, also known as RedCam, and has been its coordinator since 2018. Antonio holds a diploma in spirituality and youth and has held several youth ministry roles, including with the Jesuits and the Archdiocese of Mexico. Antonio, I invite you to offer your remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Bob, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Well, I want to start with a small reflection. We are faced with a feeling that people of sexual diversity don't exist in any pastoral manifestation, except in a few cases that are not precisely positive. We have committed to working on an inclusive church project in the Rainbow Catholics communities, showing that God's love does not exclude anyone. Still, it is precisely in the peripheries where it's mainly manifested. Listening to the Catholic Church speak about a synodal process moves me a lot, because it's an invitation from the Holy Spirit to the Church in general to include and accompany those of us who have lived in the margins of any pastoral. As part of the LGBTIQ+ community, I also feel the call to live this invitation through dialogue and joint work to make this reality possible. From my own experience, I want to share that the first approach we had with the institutional church was in August 2020. The Network of the Rainbow Catholics Mexico, the Network of the Rainbow Catholics Mexico team had a virtual meeting with Monsignor Rogelio Cabrera, Archbishop of Monterrey and President of the Episcopate Conference Mexican. I want to quote what he told us in that meeting. "I understand that after rejection, after injury, many decide to make their way apart," referring to the LGBTIQ+ community. "Many live their Catholic faith in silence, few do so openly. Nobody is kicked out of the house, much less for being homosexual." After that meeting, we started a joint project, because of which a new group of women of diversity was formed in this city in approximately 1 year. In addition, almost a year ago, I had the opportunity to participate in the first Ecclesial Assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean, held from November 21st to 28th in 2021. in which around 1,000 assembly members participated virtually and in person. The reflective work during this assembly was carried out in small teams of about 15 people, each made up of bishops, priests, religious, and laity. As a result, 41 challenges to work on were obtained. I want to highlight the number 38 out of these 41. That is, promote a church, a house of love, in which cultural, ethnic, and sexual diversities are integrated. To conclude, I want to share the beautiful moment that the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics had 2 weeks ago in the Basilica of Guadalupe during our 4th assembly. Before beginning the Mass, we were blessed and received with open arms as a mother does. That is the call to synodality, embracing everyone with love regardless of our colors. We have a great challenge ahead because we want to work together to welcome and fully integrate sexually diverse people like any other Baptist person. We are emphasizing that as LGBTIQ plus people, our diversity is a gift and that no one can be forced to give up their identity or interpersonal relationship. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Finally, last but not least, we have Benjamin O from Australia. Benjamin is the co-chair and founder of Rainbow Catholics Interagency for Ministry, an umbrella body that brings together LGBTQ affirming Catholic agencies, organizations, groups, and ministries from around Australia. Benjamin works and teaches cross-cultural education, interfaith and intercultural dialogue, human rights, racial justice, international development aid, LGBTQIA religious realities, and peace and conflict studies. Benjamin.
Hi everyone. So I'm Benjamin O, and I'm calling you from the Wanga land of the Eora Nation, Sydney, Australia. So I go by the pronouns of he and him. Thank you, New Ways, for bringing us together as a global Catholic family. So just to give you a bit of context for the Australian reality, the Fifth Plenary Council of Australia just ended in July 2022, which is about 2-3 months ago. And it started in 2018 and interrupted by the coronavirus. So we have a parallel process that has been happening both on the Synod and Synodality as well as the Plenary Council. So now the last time the Catholic Church in Australia had a Plenary Council was in 1937. So it's nearly 100 years, about over 80 years since the church gathered. So a lot has changed. We are hoping that it won't take us another 100 years to have something like that. But so we have been rather busy. So some of our siblings and colleagues would probably say that they are exhausted from all of the discerning and listening and responding and praying. On a personal level, I've been part of various processes, both as a point of support as co-chair of the interagency, but also as an ordinary participant, Catholic participant through the diocese and parish processes, Catholic organizations as response to both the Plenary Council and the synodal process. It's been quite full on for some of us, sometimes wonderfully life-giving, but sometimes quite painful. As LGBTIQ Catholic organizers and sometimes in our work by the interagency, we know that parishes, Catholic communities and organizations have been participating and making submissions in their feedback both to the Synod as well as the Plenary Council, feeding back to them Catholic LGBTIQ voices, realities and stories. Catholics in Australia, including LGBTIQ Catholics, have asked for the church to address or redress issues of discrimination, religious trauma, and spiritual abuse faced by LGBTIQA plus peoples, but also more specifically LGBTIQ Catholic siblings, that is experienced in and by our church. Catholics have asked for diverse LGBTIQ Catholic stories, gifts, and contribution. They are loving relationships, families, to be honored by our church. Repeatedly, we have heard and seen how Catholics have asked that church teachings that are harmful and damaging, such as terms that we are all too familiar with, like objectively disordered and intrinsically evil, to be abandoned, and for positive teachings, both theological and pastoral, in line with the gospel, as well as the sensus fidei, fidelium, the sense of the faithful, to be reflected. Sadly, whilst there are varying degrees of recognition of wanting to be more inclusive, which itself is a problematic term, because the term inclusion already falsely assumed that LGBTIQA plus Catholics are not part of not every part of our church, because we are. There was none of the proposals that was put forward by Catholics affirming their LGBTIQ siblings were actually taken up by the national synthesis. So there is still sadly a feeling of editing out and erasure, yet we, I think, as Catholics, as Christians, we remain prayerful and hopeful, especially for our young and for those who remain vulnerable. Many Catholics view that the Australian National Synthesis on LGBTIQ Catholic realities was not entirely reflective and lackluster, when the actual document couldn't even bring itself to mention properly the common use acronym LGBT. I must say that was not surprising. But what was surprising was that more than 2/3 of the dioceses and eparchies that made submissions from a diocesan level has reflected the voices of Catholics in Australia, calling for the need for justice through inclusion, through acknowledgement of LGBTIQ Catholic stories, realities, and voices. Even though only 7 of the dioceses and eparchies did not mention, that is out of 31, did not mention or reflected concerns for LGBTIQA plus Catholic realities in their submission, only 4 were particularly negative, or if you like, negligent. I think that's what my colleague called it. And sadly have seemingly edited out the voices and realities of LGBTIQA plus Catholics. We know that because sadly 2 out of the 4 diocesan submission had LGBTIQA affirming Catholic leaders and ministry who participated in their diocesan processes. And none of their stories, naming of issues were mentioned. And in fact, some of their concerns raised with the interagency member organization is that they would need to submit directly to Rome to ensure that their voices, they were wondering whether they need to submit directly to Rome to ensure that those voices were not censured or erased from the diocesan synthesis. And this synthesis, and these dioceses are not small rural Catholic dioceses, which itself is also a surprise, because some of these dioceses, smaller dioceses, have really spoke really candidly about Catholic LGBTIQ Catholic realities. These 2 dioceses are archdioceses that have significant LGBTIQ population as part of their communities. So that is just a bit of a snippet of our reality at the moment. But we remain in prayer and in hope with God.
Thank you, Benjamin. Now we're going to move into a period of questions. So as I mentioned, I invite you to ask your questions in the Q&A feature with Zoom, and I will go ahead and spotlight our panelists here. And the first question I want to start us off with, and I'm going to give Dumisani the first chance to answer. because he has to leave us soon. But it's simply listening to each other. What insights did you find most important, most helpful for your own work, most hopeful about where we're all going? Dumisani, I'll give you a chance to answer. And then anyone else who would like to jump in, just feel free to unmute and speak.
Thank you very much, Rob. I think what's important and the insights that we realize that we have in especially in Africa, is the queer community and the LGBTI issues are not something that have been discussed in the church. Now we have a platform to talk about issues that affect the queer community. And we see that there is a lot that is going on that we need to focus on, especially on the lives of the queer bodies. As you may know, that there's been a lot of unrest in South Africa, and there's been a lot of murders, suicide amongst transgender community because of the lack of acceptance in our community, which has been perpetrated by religious institutions. And our church, in particular, Holy Trinity Catholic Church in Braamfontein, is going to be embarking on a campaign on trying to conscientize the community or the parishioners on the importance of the lives of people within our church, and that the church should welcome everybody. A church should be a safe space for everybody, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Because being queer does not mean that you are different when you are approaching God. It's only different in other ways, but we are all human beings, and we need to be treated as such within the church, within the community, and society. Rob?
And just go next, so that the silence is filled. I'm seriously very inspired and thoughtful after hearing from all of you, especially with this very inspired setup with people from all continents except Antarctica. Because in the global way in Germany, it's a real and valid concern that we're too far ahead with how we go about the queer questions for LGBTQ plus community questions. And it would be such a blessing to have, you know, an international statement of a global community of queer people to say, no, we have these issues globally and they are addressed globally, just not necessarily by the authorities, because they are muted or made invisible, these voices, and that's part of the problem. And on the front of my head, it's just the question arises if such a thing could be possible to take away fear, because actually the synodal way in Germany is seen very critically by the Vatican and Rome in general, especially due to these questions we raise and we are outspoken about, even though our bishops aren't that outspoken about them still. And I'm wondering if we could come up with a solution to give more support in that general field.
Thank you, Mara. I was just thinking, for me, the big benefit of the synodal process and from listening to everybody is that it has started a conversation that has never happened before. And when I was doing the report, I realized that the voices I had heard on that day in the focus group, I mean, the bishop told us, they said, just keep it to 1 page, but it was actually 10 pages. And I thought, no, the voice of LGBT people haven't been heard in our church before. So I don't care if it goes to 10 pages. He's just going to have to live with it. And I recorded what they said. And, you know, it was really moving listening to them. And it was because many of them had, you know, were people of faith. And I thought, if only there were cameras here, if people could see, because the oppression, I could feel then the weight of the oppression of thousands of years of oppression, that this LGBT voice had been suffocated and stifled. And here in this little focus group, I was hearing the pain and I was hearing these people had faith, and the church itself was the big persecutor, and yet they had such faith. And that's why, for me, it was so important to get that report done. And it did have an impact, because bishops and clerics who read it afterwards did say to me that it was a bit of a wake-up call, because it made us human. You had people saying things like, there was one woman in the group who said she worried about when she died, what would her funeral be like? Would her partner be even referred to? Would she be treated with respect? She was worried about that. And there was a couple in the group, 2 men, and they were just weeks away from their marriage, and they were so upset that they couldn't get married in a Catholic church, because the Catholic Church was their community. So I had to record all that. It was really moving. And I wanted to convey, and I think the report did, that these are people. We're flesh and blood. We're just like you. You can't dissect us and say your sexuality. We don't like that part of you. We come as we are. We come as God-given. We're all right. And the beauty about the synodal process, from my point of view, is that for the first time, I was able to say all this to a bishop who had up until then only seen us as abstractions, LGBT people, a series of letters. But here we were telling him, and we were ordinary people. So the first phase, the consultation, at least in Ireland, I was sorry to hear in Hong Kong that your findings were erased or they weren't reflected. That's dreadful, that's terrible. But ours did get into the national synthesis. So that's the first phase. So that has given me hope. But like Mara, of course, we're all anxious to see what the global process will produce. But you know what, at this stage, I think one step at a time. Let's pray, let's do whatever we can. Let's engage, because it's all a process of education and talking, isn't it? And letting people hear us talk. And it's very hard then to turn to a group of people and say, something wrong with you, you're intrinsically disordered, you're objectively disordered, you're intrinsically evil. Because when they see us, we're real. So it's good, it's given us visibility. So sorry for going on too long. But that's what I feel the big benefit of the whole process has been.
Maybe I could chime in. Thank you all for sharing your experiences. I mean, I've been very much uplifted and inspired by so much that has gone on. And as I listen to everybody, I think I'm hearing 4 main themes here. One is really how the Synod has opened up a platform for greater visibility and for LGBTQ lives to be vocalized. But more than just the LGBTQ lives, the lives of vulnerable human beings. So I think what is really being made visible is the vulnerability of us as humans and as created in the image and likeness of God, that our lives are interconnected with each other, and a real belonging and wanting to be the body of Christ that we already are. So I think that's really much made visible. Second, as I hear everybody, is a consistency of themes that's coming up. It's a certain consistency in terms of hurts, pains, but also new insights, new life. You know, and I think that consistency gives me hope that it's not about us in different places saying different things, but there seems to be a consistent strand coming forward. You know, and I think that is where the Spirit is speaking. in that consistency as well. But even in that consistency, the third point I'm also struck by is how we are coming from different contexts. And oftentimes when we think about context, we think of context as something limiting. But I think the Synod actually pushes us to be creative and to say, no, the context doesn't have to be limiting. What are constrained may in fact be something that we can work within and work through. That there are some things in our context that enable us to do more than what other people can. So the difference in context, when we put it, I thought that that whole question of context and what context enables us to do, you know, where I can't do certain things, other places can do it. Where my own context in Singapore is very much, we work in and through the institution. So a lot of it is working with bishop and having consultation there, being very mindful about all the concerns we have, you know, and to the extent that right now, I'm just very encouraged by our current bishop, who's the cardinal right now, who's actually going to open. I mean, in fact, the ministry here now is moving towards being an office that looks into the pastoral care for LGBTQ Catholics. So that for me is a move. But all I'm saying is what the context enables us to do. And the last point I want to say also is this: I think as I hear everybody, there's a sense of how we can never control the outcome. As much as we want to control it and make it our way, it's really the way of the Spirit that surprises, even in the midst of disappointment. You know, and I guess that's where the hope is. The hope is in something that we cannot see, but we are given a glimpse of something already there. You know, and I think that is where, back to that point on vulnerability, that there's a sense that this is a moment of discernment. It's a moment of cooperating with the Spirit that throws us into chaos. And this is what I like about it, right? Is that the whole church right now is thrown into chaos. In fact, nobody had an idea. What are we doing? You know, but I think in the chaos is where the creativity is. In the chaos is where there is this newfound sense of hope. And just, you know, as what Ursula pointed out, is one step at a time, and just allowing the Spirit to lead. So 4 themes.
I want to jump in here. We only have a few minutes left for questions, and I think there's come in the comments and kind of from myself, because in the United States, one of the difficulties we're facing now is new policies from bishops restricting the participation of transgender and non-binary people. And so we've had a few questions about, you know, much of the discourse is around the LGBTQ and less of the T. And I'm wondering, what was the participation like of trans and non-binary people? Was this something that came up, or do you feel that this was an area that your communities are still growing? I know here in the US, this has become, you know, as I said, the bishop's sort of focal point, but I'm not sure the advocacy is there matching it yet. So I wonder if anyone has thoughts on that. And we have probably 7-8 minutes left. So if you could just, you know, be brief, and we can get as many people as possible.
I think, Bob, I think the question on trans and gender diverse, non-binary Catholic realities, it's really, really pertinent, because there is definitely a lot of feeling of erasure and editing out for that in both the plenary council as well as the synodal process, because there is a lot of speaking about, as what you say, on sexuality, but there is very little understanding clearly that it is, you know, trans and non-binary and gender diverse realities are not a sexuality per se issue, and they don't get that. And so for us, that just, they often collapse all of it together as a diverse sexuality issue in terms of all the synthesis, so that was interesting on its own. And it is very disconcerting, because I think the shift in terms of the vehement opposition has now moved further towards trans, non-binary, gender diverse siblings, Catholic siblings. And so for us, some of our trans siblings and non-binary siblings who have Catholic siblings who have come onto the conversation, I think they come with heaps amount of burden, because they have to both talk about their trauma and then provide a solution, and then also have to provide what it means to be a gift, because they are such gifts to our church. They are stories, they are theology, they have so much to teach us about a non-binary God, about a God that is really transformative for them. But we don't hear a lot of that. So thank you for picking that up.
I want to say something about the specific this topic about the trans people, because maybe in our realities, in our communities, in our context, we are not attending this sector. Then it's difficult to express with our voices that are not represented. For example, we are very excited because in Latin America, we have our first trans leader, a woman trans leader in Costa Rica. And it's very, very exciting to listen what is the real necessities of this sector, because we only speak about our experience, but we need to listen what is they need. Not only that we suppose what are their needs. I don't know if I am clear, but it's important to have in context.
I think in Singapore, we did have some parents who come on the Zoom with transgender children. And also we have one person who is transgender also coming onto our Zoom. I think where we are right now is we are aware of that, but it's really how do we invite them to come in and come out, into the community, and there's a whole lot of other real challenges involved. But on saying that as well, I mean, the ministry that I'm in, one of the members actually managed to do an outreach with a transgender shelter, and so what we try to do is we try to kind of extend ourselves to reach out in these various ways. But whether they participated in the synodal process or not, whether they were willing and open, is another question altogether. Yeah, but thank you for raising that question on transgender people.
I can comment real brief as a trans person myself, that it really made a difference that I was present and visible, that I'm present and visible in a synodal way. Even though I was not invited as a non-binary person or as a trans person, it made a difference, because this way bishops were forced to see me as a person, as Ursula said. It makes a difference. And I think it really changed the outlook of some bishops to see that, but I will not, I don't want to put it like it's that easy. It's been a real challenge and it's been exhausting so far. But the good thing is that now there is a visible trans community building up within the Catholic Church in Germany. And I don't know how to implement that in other places, because it's really connected with personal sacrifices and personal risks. And Germany is a relatively safe country to do that. Yeah, I hope that what we learned can help in other communities as well. But it's a topic very, very new to our discourse as well, even though general queer topics have been discussed for longer, maybe in Germany.
Thank you. There have been a number of questions from folks who are wondering what the US bishops said in their synthesis. And so I just want to answer, basically LGBT stuff did show up in two sections. And I want to highlight, one section was very much like what we've heard from the other panelists, in terms of needing to express the hurt and needing for welcome, families who need pastoral guidance, these kinds of things. But what was notable to me, there was a section titled Enduring Wounds, and they were talking about marginalized people, and they divided it between marginalized people, like people who are disabled, migrants, people who face racism, these marginalized groups, and then other marginalized groups. And I'll just read how they framed it. Those who are marginalized because circumstances in their own lives are experienced as impediments to full participation in the life of the church. And the two groups here were LGBTQ plus Catholics and people who are divorced and remarried without an annulment. And so even in saying LGBTQ people are marginalized and recognizing that come up, they had to, the bishop's synthesis had to parse that out from other people who are real marginalized people. So I'm sorry to take away from the panelists, but there were folks who were saying, what did the US bishop say after I mentioned it in the opening? Unfortunately, now I have to conclude our time together. I'm sorry to say. I want to thank each of the panelists so very much. Some were up very early, some were up very late. And I think having your perspectives is, as I said, essential for us as a global church and building this movement together. So I hope this will be but the first of conversations like this. I want to briefly tell folks about an upcoming New Ways Ministry program that may be of interest. And last spring, people might recall, we had LGBTQ spiritual conversations for the Synod. And this fall, we're continuing to have small group faith sharing discussions over Zoom. We're calling it Continuing the Synod Conversations. We're having 2 sessions, and all are welcome to attend, whether you came in the spring or not. And the point of these is less to build a report, as we were doing last time, and more to try to build understanding of one another, build solidarity and community, and understand a little more where we're going. So if this conversation was generative for you and got you thinking about different things, and you want to talk about that in a small group with other people, I invite you to come to these sessions. I'll also point out New Ways has other fall programs that you may be interested in, including a webinar on why Catholics should support LGBTQ plus non-discrimination. In a few minutes, you'll be getting an email that will have a couple of important things. One, if you could fill it out and give us some feedback. It's a quick 5-question survey, take just a couple minutes to let us know how this program was. And then also you'll find information there about the different programs we have coming up. And finally, there's information. We have recorded this event and we'll be releasing that later this month. So with that, again, thank you for being here. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to all our attendees. As I said, I hope this will be the first of many conversations. To close us out, I'm going to invite Ursula to lead us in prayer.
Thank you, Robert. Mary, our mother, we invite you to sit with us during this synod, just as you seated yourself with the first apostles in the upper room. Reconcile us to your firstborn, and let your words, do whatever Jesus tells you, resonate in our hearts. May your yes to God become our yes, as we imitate your love as a mother, proclaim God's mercy to all, and confess Jesus' abundant life to every continent and island, to every Christian, and to every home. Amen. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much. And we hope you have a good rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Take care, everyone.